Hey, High Vibe Collective, this is Jaxs and today we're going to be taking a look at our very first weekly dogma. In this series that we're starting, we're going to be taking a look at the New Age spiritual movement and some of the dogmas that have made their way to the surface or recreated themselves in a new form. And with these, the reason that this is so important is because when we look at belief systems, when we look at our personal beliefs, when we look at opinions, we look from the point of view of ourselves. We look from what it is that we believe, and sometimes when it comes to dogma, we start to superimpose on other people what it is that we feel, what it is that we think, what it is that we personally vibrate alongside. So in this very first episode, I wanted to start with something that is a little bit intense, but I think it needs to be spoken about for two reasons. The meat is murder argument that is made both in and out of the spiritual community and the two different shades of that, the principles from which it derives its energy, as well as taking a genuine look at if this is something that is applicable to our lives or if this is something that we're going to be leaving behind. So first and foremost, there's of course the meat is murder argument that is made in the vegan community, not by all vegans, because this is definitely not a anti-vegan video. This is not what this is about. I have some people very close to me, both friends, family, and loved ones who are vegan, and I love them to death, and I think that it's wonderful for each and every one of us to choose what it is that we believe in, to choose what it is that we do, to choose what it is that we vibrate alongside when it comes to morality. But there's a specific sect of veganism that focuses on the concept of meat is murder. They take it out of the scientific argument of nutrition and they move it into the argument of morality. They say that it is immoral to eat meat. And so this is based on three particular principles. One, empathy. The concept, definitely makes sense. I myself would not like to be eaten, and so I shouldn't eat another thing because it doesn't want to be eaten. So that's the first principle. Second is the concept that the act of killing an animal in order to consume it is murder. So kill and murder are clearly synonymous. However, killing an animal to eat its meat is something that is almost has a more utility kind of energy in those words. And the act of murder is something that usually has a more cold-blooded energy to it, something that is more optional, something that is purely from a place of malevolence. Third, and this is the most important part, the concept that not just that all life matters, but that all life matters equally. And so we're going to be looking into those concepts. So first and foremost, we want to take a look at what it is that is being discussed out there and the way that this is presenting itself. I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of different vegans in order to try and find kind of common ground on the very concept that meat is murder and that it is an immoral act, and that if you do this, then you are not spiritual. Then you will not be able to ascend to the 5D if you eat meat. Because there's the concept to some that, whether it's the ascension to heaven, the ascension to 5D, that there's a point in time in which we will or will not ascend there from the 3D world that we're in into the 5D. And this is based on the concept of our diet as well as other spiritual practices. So many different people have many different views on these different things. As far as the concept itself, is meat murder? I talk to people and I say, okay, well, if you have the view that meat is murder, then that, that's a pretty serious accusation, but if you believe that, then you're suggesting that essentially all of mankind are murderers, and that only those of you who are not doing this are not murderers. You're talking about every ancestor you have. You're talking about the Native American culture that, so many of spiritual practices of this New Age movement are gathered from. You're talking about almost every spiritual leader that either currently exists or ever has. You're talking about, all of mankind. You're placing a moral judgment on all of mankind. And the response that I usually get is what I would call the grocery store argument. No. I'm not saying that everyone was a murderer. I'm saying that we are now choosing to be murderers if we eat meat. And I say, why is that? Well, because we now have grocery stores. Because we have grocery stores, you can just go out and get lettuce. You can go out and get cucumbers, and it doesn't require the killing of an animal. Now, here's the problem with that. What that means is that the act of killing and eating meat is murder unless, of course, you have access to other resources. That means that this is the idea that morality is conditional based on what we possess. The problem in that thinking is, if I have a boat and Craig, who's filming this right now, if he has a boat and we, are sort of in this contract of morality where, stealing is wrong, even if I crash my boat, stealing his boat doesn't ever become right. If stealing is wrong, stealing is wrong. Even if Craig has 100 boats and I crash my one boat, it doesn't matter that I'm taking just one of his surplus of boats. The act of stealing is the act of stealing. There's no excuse for that. If you tell a lie to protect someone's feelings, which is a phrase that we often hear or sometimes have even said ourselves, it's still a lie. It doesn't become not a lie because of that. So if you believe meat is murder, then it's not excusable whether or not there's a grocery store there, because this is dependent upon the concept that there will always be a surplus of food for all people. In the first world that we live in, this is something that might be true for a lot of us. And obviously, we all hope that there would never be a war that would cause a food shortage, or freak weather that would cause a food shortage, or poor planning on part of human beings. However, these three things have happened many times throughout history, and the concept that they would never happen again is something that might be a little bit idealistic. Obviously, we all hope that that's the case, but we don't have proof that there will never be a shortage of food again. People out there in the third world right now, and many other places in between those two worlds, are in places where they're currently eating meat and they have no other choice. Our ancestors, of course, had no choice. And if you're saying that meat is murder, then they're murderers, right? And that's a very bold claim to make. It's the decision that, because you view it this way, that all people who do not feel the same, that they're wrong, and that they're not only committing a sin, but that they're committing what you might say is, the pinnacle of all sins, murder. Another problem with this is that, as we look at how, life unfolds, as we look at these different situations, we looked at the global level a second ago, and we were talking about how, on some grand scale, there might be a food shortage. There's also the suggestion on the individual level that never again would a person be put in a survival situation. There was never again, a situation where a specific person would only have meat to eat, or at the very least, have no other choice except to eat, to protect, themselves, or to protect their children or their family. The problem with these concepts is that, with all of morality that's universally understood, such as like telling truth and telling lies, when we tell lies, we don't know it's wrong because we had to memorize that telling lies are wrong. We know that telling lies are wrong because there's a physical and bodily sensation that runs through us when we're telling a lie. It actually, our body, we can feel it physically. We can feel that it's wrong. We can feel almost this compression that's happening within, where it tries to burst to the surface. The moment we tell the truth, which would be considered right, we feel freed of that. We have a physical sensation that runs through our body, and we know that, that's the case. As far as morality that you take from this point of view and you're starting to put conditions on, we have to ask who's responsible for those conditions. I myself, am an imperfect person, and I don't believe that it would ever be my place to decide on behalf of all of mankind what is and is not moral. I can observe things that look like they're universally understood, but the concept that meat is murder is not universally understood. Part of the reason that I did this particular video in the first place is because so many people that I work alongside have the same viewpoint as me, but they do not want to film any videos on it. They don't want to talk about it publicly. And it's not because they fear any physical violence against them or anything like that. No one's making that claim. But in this digital age that we live in, many of them are afraid that if they were to say something, then they would lose their following, they would be attacked, they could be digitally harassed. And so that's why it's important to talk about this, because anyone out there who feels the same, to remember that you have the right to free speech. You have the right to speak what it is your truth. And that's one of the universal spiritual tenets that's agreed upon, regardless of whether you're on the Western or Eastern side of your philosophy when it comes to your spirituality, or somewhere, some amalgam of, some place in between. If you don't view something the same way as people, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're evil, wrong, or a murderer. If you view this differently and don't genuinely feel that this is murder, that might just be your human experience, which is what takes us to that third tenet. That third tenet, that this argument is based on the concept that all life either does or ought to matter equally. Now, I believe all life matters. That's my personal opinion. I think that every living creature matters, and I don't think that there's a question of that. From my point of view, all living creatures matter. As someone who eats meat, they matter extremely to me. I think that their life is sacred, and I think that the consumption of meat is, for me, a spiritual process and part of my spiritual belief, part of my connection to my relationship with God and with the universe, and that's just my opinion. That's not part of the argument. But that different people view this in different ways. So if we're suggesting that all life matters equally, then we have to ask ourselves honestly a few questions. First of all, if we remember Philosophy 101, a professor would bring us the problem of, okay, so there's a train and it's on the track and it divides off into two different directions. In one direction, there's a child on the tracks, and on the other direction, there's 5 elderly people. We'll say that they're 90. So the philosophy teacher asks the class, okay, which of these would you choose? You can only divert the train into one of two directions. You must make a sacrifice. Who's it going to be and why? There's not a universal consensus of who it's going to be. Some people answer this question and say that the value of 5 lives is more than the value of 1 life. Some people say that the potentiality of the child's ability to go on and live a full life and do good is more than the 5 elderly people whom, to their point of view, have already lived essentially their life. They've had their family by now. They've created their masterpiece of whatever achievement it is that it's important to them in their life. And, that you have to choose the child because they're the one who has the potential to live, rather than these people who, realistically, as they're getting on in their years, then they'll be closer to death anyways. So there's not a right or wrong answer to that question. There's not a universal consensus on what degree which lives matter. And I think we have to be honest about that. I think we have to take it into what sounds like an extreme hypothetical example, but it's not something that's impossible. It is something that has happened before, which is, if you were to choose 2 lives, the suggestion is that all life matters equally, then it's a mere coin toss between one life and another. It would just be a mere coin toss. It could be either one equally. But the reality is, if you have, of course, your child versus your family dog, you would always choose the child. You would choose the life of this child. Why would that be? Because the love, the connection, the empathy that can be sent and received back and forth between you and the relationship with this child is stronger than the one with the dog. It's not because the dog doesn't matter. Its life matters. However, you would choose the child every time. That right there shows that, besides a few people who might fanatically believe that, you should choose the dog instead, generally, all people would, of course, always choose the child. The principle that all life matters exactly equally is something that doesn't seem to hold up. Would you choose, your child over, another one of your family members, a more distant family member? You might choose your child. Would you choose, a stranger on the street who's a human versus this dog? If you had to choose which one would live, you'd probably choose the human stranger, because there's a recognition that the amount of connection, the amount of empathy sent and received is going to be more with this person than it is with the dog. And following this forward, if you have a dog and a praying mantis, you're probably going to save the life of the dog, right? Because you understand that the empathy that can be sent and received, the relationship created between you and the dog, is more than what you would experience with the praying mantis. And you might, going on to this, choose the praying mantis over the microbe that's on the ground that you can't see. Why? Well, because the praying mantis and you won't be able to share too much empathy, but the two of you will absolutely have more of a connection than this microbe. I'm suggesting, I'm not positioning the idea that all life doesn't matter equally. I'm definitely, though, asking the question, do we really apply it that way? Do we really believe that? Because if we start to measure and weigh out the fact that we actually have different scales of what it is we would sacrifice from one thing to another, from one person to another, if we can be honest about that, then I think it will help us start to find what it is we really believe. If we're walking towards this idea that we, being free of this murder, have stepped into another level of consciousness, or that we, eating meat, ought to be ashamed of ourselves because we are not being spiritual, we are not, doing the right thing, we might have to ask ourselves, was every single one of our ancestors wrong? Was every single one of them a murderer? Was every single, Native American whom we, really look at and emulate the culture of in this New Age spiritual movement, were they all wrong? Because to me, I see so many quotes on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube from these different spiritual practitioners and from just people in general who stepped into the realm of wisdom through a life of hard work and through, measuring and weighing what it is that, we sort of look at as the human condition. And, we have to be very serious if we're going to make that claim. But as we said with the grocery store argument, if you're going to make the claim that that's what it is, then be proud of that belief. And, and stick with it 100%. More power to you. However, you have to be able to look at this full spectrum honestly, and you have to honestly ask yourself, does all life matter equally in exactly the same way? Is it a mere coin toss between a child and a dog, between a dog and a praying mantis? Is it simply one way or the other, and that this exists on a permanent equal scale? If the answer to that is no, then you might want to reevaluate that and look at that. I obviously, as someone who does not have a degree in health sciences, would never attempt to make any argument about whether veganism or eating meat is good or bad on the scientific level, because that's not my place. But the reason that I needed to talk about this today, the reason I wanted to start with this dogma in particular, is not just because there's people that are afraid to speak out because they'll lose their followings, but there's also people who I've seen when I do readings, when I do mentorships for people one-on-one, who feel guilty and ashamed of themselves. People who are empathetic, loving souls, who work hard and have a family, and they care about other people. They care about, themselves in a healthy way, and they want to see good for this world. And I've seen some of these people, whether they break down into tears, whether they, are starting to well up with guilt, feel ashamed of themselves for not just eating meat, but for not feeling the same, for not having the same opinion that meat is murder. They feel bad for not having this opinion. And the thing is, what we feel, what we personally believe to be true, is valid to us to be able to express. That's part of freedom. If we don't have freedom, then do we really have love? If we don't have freedom, do we really have the ability to create and to make the life that we want in alignment with God? So this is our very first dogma that we're looking at this week. Next week, we're going to be looking at religion, spirituality, and the way in which some of these dogmas and themes have remanifested themselves in a new way here in our collective, and what it is that we should look at when we're having this conversation. But I want to clarify one last time. This conversation is not making an accusation. This conversation is not picking on any particular group. This conversation is about opening a dialogue so that we can all express that we totally agree that meat is murder, that we totally disagree that meat is murder, that we have different opinions and viewpoints on it, and that these opinions and viewpoints need to be respected by other people, even if we ourselves can't agree with them, to be able to look at what another person thinks and feels. Because, regardless of if you're a secular spiritualist, deeply religious, or an atheist, one tenet that kind of runs through all of these spiritualities and religions is it is not the place of any one particular man or group of people to decide on behalf of all other people what is moral, that judgment belongs to God, judgment belongs to the universe, or to a higher source that is able to be truly objective about these things, and not someone whose will is subjectively bent by circumstances or their own particular biases. So thank you guys so much for tuning in today for this first episode. I can't wait to talk to you all next week.